So we have a new way of thinking about substance use disorders that it's really a continuum. You've got use that really is pretty normal in the US, and then you go all the way to the other end and you've got people that are dying from substance use. Hey everybody, I'm Tom Britton. Welcome to our channel. I'm the CEO of American Addiction Centers. I'm a person in long-term recovery and an expert in addiction treatment. Today we're going to talk about opioid addiction and the way you access treatment. And also, if you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're always adding new content, and you can get on at any point and hear what we're doing. Please check out our helpful links if you're interested in getting treatment for yourself or a loved one, or even if you just want to learn more about addiction. So as we think about opioids, there's really kind of two main classes of the drug. So first, thinking about it, anything that is called opiates is something that comes from the opium plant, the poppy plant itself. Anything that's called an opioid is something that's created synthetically in a lab. So as we look at medications like morphine and codeine and things like that, those all come from the plant, and we've had those in the US for a long, long time. What they found is that the supply of that was harder to get, and so they started creating synthetic opioids in the lab, things like fentanyl that we see today. And as I think about prescription drugs and illicit drugs, prescription drugs are anything that are prescribed to you by a physician. Those are things like oxycodone, OxyContin, Vicodin, and they're given primarily for pain disorders. Many people take them after surgeries or after an injury, something like that. Those drugs can be diverted, where instead of being purchased in a pharmacy by a doctor, you can buy them on the street. And so on the street, what we see is pharmaceutical drugs like that, and we also see illicit drugs like heroin and so forth. The challenging thing right now is that almost every single pill that is sold on the street has synthetic opioids in it, like fentanyl, even when they're being suggested to be things like ketamine or benzos like Valium and Xanax, et cetera, which is why we have such an overdose epidemic in the US right now. So, the overdose epidemic has really been the biggest public health crisis for 5 to 10 years now. Before COVID came on the scene, by far biggest public health crisis in the country. It was the leading cause of death for people under 50 years old out of anything else, any other injuries, heart attacks, et cetera. And I think about what a scary sign that is, that when that was going on, I was under 50 and I was more likely to die of an overdose than anything else. So the drivers of this is that kind of in the early teens, there was a significant overprescribing of pain pills in the US, and a lot of people got addicted to pain pills. Typically, they'd have a surgery, they'd have an injury, they were prescribed huge amounts of the drug, and the doctors didn't really know too much then about what is too much. And when one takes opioids or opiates in the body, we get used to it, we develop tolerance, and therefore we use more and more and more. So what we saw in the US is that addiction migrated into the use of illicit drugs, illegal drugs. And as in the beginning stages, it's easier to know how much of a drug is in a pill, for example, when it's a pharmaceutical drug. When synthetic opioids started to come in, that's where all the bets kind of changed. Fentanyl, for example, the amount that one uses is very, very small within a pill or within a liquid form or within a powder. And so the kind of risk of overdose is that drug brings you right to the edge, but too much, it's very hard to tell. So I could use the same amount of liquid or the same amount of powder this time versus that time, but this time it has just a little more fentanyl, and that's what leads to me dying at that point. If I look at the last 10 years, we've literally increased almost 20 to 30% every single year. And last year, over 100,000 people died of a drug overdose. It's literally one person every 4 minutes in the US. A lot of people ask, why do we prescribe opioids or opiates, period? Fentanyl is not really something that's typically prescribed for somebody on an outpatient basis. The only time it's ever given on an outpatient basis is typically somebody who's in late stage cancer, for example, and their pain is so dramatic and they're at the end of their life. Somebody else, it might be a significant surgery that they're recovering from. Much more common is the prescribing of medications like oxycodone, OxyContin, et cetera. Fentanyl is used much more on the inpatient side. So if you've ever had surgery, you'll have an anesthesiologist in the room, and that's the person that kind of brings you down to the right level of consciousness where you're not going to die, but you're not going to feel pain. And fentanyl is one of the biggest drugs used for that purpose. But that anesthesiologist is trained exactly where to bring you to. The reason why so many people die from overdose from fentanyl is because they don't have that understanding of the drug, they don't know the dosing of the drug, and they take just a little bit too much, and that's when they die. So if we look at the past, substance use was really put into two categories. It was either abuse or dependence. And what we learned about drug use is really it doesn't easily fall into categories. And so we have a new way of thinking about substance use disorders, that it's really a continuum. You've got use that really is pretty normal in the US, and then you go all the way to the other end and you've got people that are dying from substance use. And so when we think about abuse and addiction, abuse really is where I'm using something in a harmful way, and yet I continue to use. And that's kind of the category. So maybe it's drinking and driving, maybe it's unsafe sexual behavior, maybe it's risk, physical harm, something like that. As we continue to use substances and as we use more and more substances, that use becomes much more regular in the system, and we start to build tolerance and withdrawal and things like that. And that's typically what we think about as addiction in the US. Every single person has within their body the potential to become addicted to a substance. That what is unique about people is that kind of the amount of use one has to use to get to that point is different for every single person. Some people genetically have a higher predisposition to addiction. So if I have a parent with a substance use problem, I am more likely to develop a substance use problem. So the easiest answer to that is that the more one uses and the longer one uses, the more likely they develop a problem. And if you think about your own use, if you realize you're doing things that are causing you problems and you stop or you go back down, that's most people's response, in the US. But other people, rather than stopping at that point where you're seeing problems, they continue to use. And if they continue to use in that kind of way, that's when the problem and the dependence really accelerates. And we begin to have physical effects and mental effects and social effects. So if you think about substance use in general, it's on a continuum. There's people that are using substances normally, in the way that the culture kind of defines normal. And that's a hard one to define. What is normal use? And then we kind of get in the category where we're taking things as they're not prescribed. So maybe I'm taking more medication than my doctor said I'm to take, or I'm taking drugs off the street. And they're causing problems in my life. Like I'm seeing problems at work, for example, or my relationship, or maybe I'm driving under the influence of drugs. If I continue doing those things, especially with opioids, my body starts to get dependent upon it. Physically, it gets dependent upon it. And the way you can understand if you're becoming physically dependent on opioids is that you have to take more to get the same result. And if that happens, if I can take a 9 milligram Oxycontin pill, for example, and I get a certain result, but then I have to go up to 18 and 36, up to 80, that means that my body is getting used to it. And that means that when I stop using it, I'm going to have withdrawal symptoms. The things to look for with addiction of any substance, including opioids, first is that you have cravings to do it. That typically in a healthy relationship with alcohol, for example, I might want a beer after work when I get home, but I'm not like counting the seconds down to it. And so with opioids specifically, because there's a physical dependence that can be created on opioids, that people that become dependent upon it, they start to want that next pill, they start to physically crave the next pill, and it's literally your body is detoxing, which is what's creating the craving. And so I have to watch a few things on opioids. So one is, do I have that physical dependence on the drug? That is a huge indication. But also, is it starting to influence my life in a negative way? That maybe my wife is not happy with me. Maybe I'm not doing as well at work. Maybe I'm starting to sacrifice things that really matter to me and matter to other people at the expense of using. That using becomes more important than any other thing. Sure, so if I'm asking the bigger question of do I have a substance use disorder that needs treatment specifically, we look at a few different areas to understand how the drug is influencing you. And it can be any drug. It can even be things like sex and gambling and so forth. But one place we look is mentally, how is it affecting me? Do I have increased levels of depression or anxiety or guilt? Do I have cravings for that substance on the physical side? Am I starting to have physical complications of it? Do I wake up feeling sick? Do I have withdrawal symptoms? And then the other part is really kind of the outside of my life. So we've got the mental health in the head, we've got the physical dependence, but then there's the social functioning. And that's the piece where I'm starting to look at, is it influencing my ability to be a good employee, a good husband, a good friend, a good son, all those different things. Do I lose my job because of it? Have I been arrested because of it? The more of those boxes that are checked, the more likely I have a problem. I think what is hard for people is we have some of these sayings that, well, as long as I go to work, I don't have a problem. Or as long as I don't lose my job, or as long as my wife doesn't leave me. But those don't really mean whether or not we have a problem. because addiction and substance use affects so many different domains of our life. And we have to really evaluate, is there one or more area of our lives that are really getting negatively impacted? And if so, that's a good time to talk to a professional and figure out, do I have a problem or not? You know, I've had 2 surgeries in the last year and a half, and it's a fantastic question because I'm a person in long-term recovery, so I'm very sensitive towards it. I don't want to use substances in a way that bring me old problems. And so the very first thing that I encourage everybody to do is have a conversation with their doctor, before the surgery and say, here are my concerns. How can we manage this? And typically, most physicians will give a 3 to 5 day supply of opioid medication following a surgery. And if I take something for 3 to 5 days as prescribed, I'm really not going to develop a problem. That our body starts to get dependent on it even within that period, but it's very, very minimal. I think where you need to pay attention and be careful is if you're wanting to take that substance for a longer period of time, that you really should talk to your doctor about that. What I have learned and what the field understands is that our relationship to pain can really be amplified, that we can focus on the pain and think it's a much bigger problem than it is, and we can have the belief, I'm not supposed to have any pain. But the reality is if I have a surgery or a major injury, I'm going to have pain. And pain is okay, it's just not pleasant. Opioids affect our bodies and our minds is the kind of easiest way to answer the question about long-term opioid impacts. So from a body standpoint, the longer I take the drug, the more physically dependent I am on it, which means I progressively need to take more and more drugs to get the same impact. And for many people who start taking opioids with a physician, eventually the physician says, I'm not prescribing them anymore. And so one has to go to the street to get the drug. And so one of those risks is if I go to the street, I don't really know what I'm taking. So the overdose risk for me personally goes up dramatically the longer time that I use it. The other part is that it creates mental health disorders like depression, like anxiety. It creates sleep disorders. On the body itself, it's also linked very clearly to physical problems. If you think about Matthew Perry from Friends, for example, he became addicted to Vicodin. And at the height of his addiction, he was taking 55 pills a day from his report. The liver is what processes all toxins in the body. Its job is to filter out bad stuff. Under normal conditions, it can work. It can filter everything bad out of our body and not have problems. But if I put a certain amount of drugs in my body, it starts to fail and it can't get all the toxins out, which means in essence, we become poisoning the body. The physical effects of any substance, including opioids, at any point I can stop and the harm doesn't continue to grow. There's some harms that will repair and other harms that won't repair. Liver damage is one that at a certain point, we can have an inflamed liver that gets uninflamed, and we're okay. But I think what we need to be mindful of is really the body is a very complicated process. Our vital organs work in concert together in a very sophisticated way, but they're not designed to have large amounts of alcohol, large amounts of opioids, et cetera. And so they can damage permanently the entire system. But what we do know is as soon as you stop, the harm stops increasing. And that's really, really important. I think the most important thing for somebody to understand is that they don't have to be a treatment professional to make decisions about what they do for treatment for themselves or somebody they love. That there's an entire field of experts that are master's level, counselors, that are trained physicians. There's addictionologists, which is a physician who has had extra board certified training. And what I recommend to all people is that reach out to somebody who is trained and talk through what's happening in your life. And they can help you understand, do you have a problem? And if you do, how severe is it? Because based on how severe it is, that really decides whether or not you go to treatment and how intensive a treatment. So some people go to outpatient treatment where they get counseling and it's quick and they kind of put it behind them. Other people go to outpatient and they get medication, assisted treatments to help them to kind of get off opioids. And others need to go into a facility where they get much more intensive treatment. And I think the most important thing is really if you think you have a problem or if somebody in your family or someone who loves you is telling you that they're worried that you have a problem, the likelihood is that you probably do. In centers like American Addiction Centers, like my company, that we have 24-hour call available where you can just call and talk to somebody. And there's lots and lots of resources like that. this shows my age a little bit, but they used to talk about the 200-pound telephone, that literally it was so heavy to lift up that it was really hard. And I think there's a point of surrender where somebody, kind of comes to a point where they're like, I just really don't like how I'm living, and I don't like the impact of substances on my life. And that period can last for years, where I feel like that, but I don't pick up that phone. And, what's important for anybody to understand is that there's really no risk to picking up the phone. To reaching out and asking, do I have a problem, is not walking into a treatment center. And what I really encourage is take it in bite sizes. Talk to somebody and see what kind of problem you have. Think about the recommendation that they make. Have that be one decision point. If you agree with them and you decide, yes, I need, treatment, then go into the next decision point of where would I go and why would I go and how long would I go. And, you can kind of put these decisions, one after another rather than all at once. And something that companies like mine have done is we've made it really easy that there's any way to do it. That you can text us and have a text conversation, for example. I don't even have to pick up the phone anymore. I can have email communication. I could have a phone conversation. Like, there's so many different ways. I could walk into one of our treatment centers and say I need help. That, something that's been important to me is to create a system where there's no wrong door. That anyone who wants to get treatment can reach out in any way possible.